Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, actually a special version of Living History, because what I'm doing today is something a little bit different to what I normally do. I do the podcasts, I do the Facebook Live presentations, and people have been asking me to do both. So I'm combining them into one. So however you choose to receive this information is really up to you. You can hopefully tune in live now on Facebook and save your questions, and at the end when we finish this, we can discuss all of your questions about visiting the Western Front, but also this will be available and going out on the podcast. And if you haven't checked out the podcast for those Facebook Live watchers, please do so. You can get it on iTunes and various other means. It's called Living History with Matt McLaughlin, and we discuss some great things and speak to lots of very interesting historians. Today, we're going to talk about visiting the Western Front, which is a question I get asked all the time, and I thought it's probably well overdue for me to share some of my experience with how you can get out, visit the Western Front, walk the ground. This is going to be a discussion from a very Australian perspective, so I apologise to my international viewers and listeners that we are not talking specifically about your countries. We are talking specifically about the Australians, but I should also say that the information I'm providing applies to many countries who fought, so you can modify this as you see fit to expand beyond just the Australian operations to also include other sites as well, British, Canadian, New Zealand, American even. You can expand this information to visit those sites as well. So it's going to be a good experience, hopefully. It's something, as I said, I do get asked a lot, exactly how do you go about visiting the Western Front. So we're going to dig deeply into that, and hopefully you'll come away from this presentation with all the information you need about visiting the Western Front. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping matters. I mean, welcome back is the first thing to say. This is the first podcast, the first Facebook Live of 2019. It's wonderful to have you back with me. I hope you had a very safe and happy Christmas and New Year break. I can't believe that it's 2019. It's just unbelievable that it seems like the year 2000 seems like only yesterday. Time is certainly flying by, and it's the end of the centenary period now. We have finished now with those great centenaries that we've been commemorating since 2014. And now they're all in the past. It's been more than 100 years since the First World War, if you can believe that. And I'm not quite sure how to feel about it. I feel like we achieved some wonderful things during those last 4 years. A lot of people learnt about the First World War and were brought to this history in a very engaged way during those centenaries, which is wonderful. And I met some thousands of wonderful people during the course of the centenary period on battlefields all over the world. So that was very special. Gallipoli in 2015, Posi and Fromelles in 2016, Bullecourt, Passchendaele in 2017, Villiers Bretno, Remembrance Day in 2018, and many others that we commemorated over the course of the last 100 years. So it's been a really very special 4 years. But I'm sure for the future of remembrance, the future of battlefield visits looks bright. We're seeing lots of people wanting to come on our tours to 2019 and beyond, and it's very exciting to see that. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to this new era that is not overshadowed by the big centenaries. And also, we shouldn't forget, remembrance is not just about the First World War. We should remember the Second World War, and we're in the midst of the 75th anniversaries, Vietnam, 50th anniversaries, lots of other great chapters of Australian military history we can focus on, even without the centenaries of the First World War. Speaking of walking the ground and visiting battlefields, a couple of months ago I announced the signature tour that I would be leading in September this year to the battlefields of the Western Front. The first tour that I actually am going to be personally escorting for a very long time. And thank you so much for the response. That tour has now sold out. We sold that tour out in about 3 weeks, which was incredibly gratifying. I now have the job to live up to all your expectations, but thank you so much for your desire to come and walk the battlefields with me. It's going to be wonderful to get back over there and see those battlefield sites. So it was very popular, the signature tour. So I think next year for 2020, I'll probably do more than one signature tour. So perhaps Vietnam, perhaps Gallipoli, who knows? But we'll have a couple of extra signature tours in 2020. So you'll have more of a chance to walk the battlefields with me if that's something you are interested in doing. Speaking of walking battlefields, if you haven't checked out the documentaries that I have made recently, please do. There's currently 2. Both of them are up on Facebook, both are up on YouTube. One about the battlefields of the Somme in 1916, and one about behind the lines of the First World War, which was a very interesting documentary to make. We visited the chateau at Bertong, where Monash had his headquarters in 1918. We visited Vignecourt, which was famous as the place where Soldiers had their photographs taken in a farmhouse in Vignicourt, and we visited, probably most spectacularly, the underground city at Noir in France. And this was a place where soldiers went to visit in the First World War as tourists. In downtime, when they were behind the lines, they went and visited this incredible system, this city, this underground city of caverns and caves and tunnels beneath the village of Noir. And while they were there, as soldiers often do, they left their mark. They signed their names on all the walls. And so now there's thousands of signatures, and it's a really wonderful place to go and visit. So we'll be incorporating these into our tours in the future. But in the meantime, to get a little sneak peek, go to Facebook, go to YouTube, and check out the videos that we've done under the brand Living History TV. And there's going to be many more coming out. We've got many more plans to roll out more of those Living History documentaries. So keep looking out for those, keep responding. We've already had 50,000 downloads of the first one, the Battle of the Somme, in only 2 weeks. So it's wonderful. Thank you again for engaging so strongly with this history. It's important we remember. And thank you very much for playing your part in doing that. What's 2009 going to hold? As I said, an interesting year coming up. No major centenaries. We've got the 75th anniversaries of the 1944 battle, so D-Day is going to be probably the main one in June. But I'm looking forward to people just visiting the battlefields, not because there's a big commemoration, but simply because they want to, particularly if you are visiting Europe or Asia or somewhere else in the world. Please feel free to look at our tours that can slot very neatly in with your itinerary to walk the ground of the battlefields. So moving on to that specific topic, the Western Front, one of the most popular battlefields for Australians. In fact, I think probably now the most important and popular, if that is the right word, for battlefields for Australians to visit. Gallipoli is always iconic, but Gallipoli is a little bit more difficult to visit. A little bit further away. Turkey's a little bit more of an adventurous destination, and unfortunately in recent years Turkey has suffered from a bad image in the Western world in particular. But it's great to see that the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has recently downgraded their travel advisories to Turkey. So effectively they're now saying that Turkey is once again safe to visit. Personally, I felt it always was safe to visit, that the upgrading of the travel warnings was an overreaction. But the government's finally caught up to that attitude. So it's good to see that Gallipoli is back on the menu for a lot of people, and we're starting to see that now. We're starting to see a lot of bookings now for people coming through for Gallipoli. But I think the Western Front is really the destination that's captured the imagination of people in recent years. And there's been, obviously, the centenary of the battles at Villers-Bretonneux and Remembrance Day, and the centenaries of all those famous actions that took place on the Western Front have really captured the imagination, and a lot of Australians now are visiting the Western Front, and you really should. It's a wonderful destination. So hopefully this presentation we're doing today, this podcast and this Facebook Live presentation, will give you the information you need to make the journey to the Western Front, and I'd love to see you over there. Let's start with a little bit of a history lesson, very, very, very briefly. Why do we call it the Western Front? What was Australia doing over there? The Western Front is in France and Belgium. The reason it was called the Western Front is because that was a term coined by the Germans, because the Germans, as you may recall from your high school history studies, had two main enemies, or three main enemies. They had France and Britain on one side, and then Russia on the other side, and then the associated powers such as Australia and the other colonies, and then eventually America as well, fighting alongside France and Britain. So from the German perspective, they had to fight a war on two fronts. They had the big fight against the Russians to their east on their what they call the Eastern Front, and they had the fight against the French and the British on their Western Front. And so it was a term that we adopted as the Allies as well to refer to those two theatres of war, the Eastern and the Western Fronts. So when we talk about the Western Front, we're talking about France and Belgium. The same term was used in the Second World War because, of course, that situation repeated in the Second World War. Germany had to fight on two fronts against the British and the Americans and the French at the start of the war on the Western Front, and then, of course, the Russians on the Eastern Front. So the term was repeated again during the Second World War, but when we say Western Front, we are generally, in this context, referring to the Allied operations during the First World War, 1914 to 1918 on the Western Front. So the war began in 1914. British troops, French troops were fighting against Germans in this area of France and Belgium. So we're talking up the north of France and the little southern tip of Belgium. The British and the French were fighting there from the opening days of the war, but the Australians didn't fight there immediately, of course, because we were at Gallipoli in 1915. So the Australians came to the Western Front after the Gallipoli evacuation. So the very earliest Australian troops arrived in late 1915. This is controversial. Things I've read say that the Australians didn't get there until the start of 1916, but I have seen there is a grave, in particular I'm thinking of in France, of an Australian soldier from late in 1915. So at least some Australian soldiers were already moving to France to start preparations for the Australian occupation of the Western Front in 1915, very late in 1915. Of course, the bulk of the Australian forces didn't evacuate Gallipoli until December 1915. So they started arriving. They went to Egypt, they refitted, then they had basically the AIF doubled in size with new recruits, and they were shipped over to France. They arrived in France. The bulk of the forces arrived in France in 1916, and then they fought in France and Belgium in 1916, 1917, and 1918. And the work that the Australians did in those 3 years was absolutely amazing. And we don't want to overstate it too much. Australians often are guilty of stating that we won the war. We don't want to overstate our importance, but we do have to say that the evolution of the Australian forces on the Western Front between 1916 and 1918 was quite incredible. And we did punch above our weight. We did play a very significant role as a strike force in the British Army, so we shouldn't forget that. And I personally believe particularly 1918 was probably our most important military year. In terms of everything that we've done in our rich military history, I don't think anything competes with what happened in 1918, with the fact that we were the strike force being thrown in against the Germans, along with the Canadians and several British units. We were the main strike force against the Germans, particularly in the middle of 1918 and in August, September, October, that time period. We captured a large number of prisoners. We took a lot of ground. The Australians were a very good fighting force, among the best in the British Army. That's not to say there weren't British units as good as the Australians. There certainly were, or better than the Australians. But we were certainly an elite fighting force. And I think the work that we did in 1918 was some of our most important work of our entire military history, probably our most important military year. So it's worth following what the Australians did between 1916 and 1918 on the Western Front. And when you look at the scale of the losses there, we had probably about 300,000 Australians who served on the Western Front compared to about 50,000 who served at Gallipoli. And at Gallipoli, we lost 8,000 dead. On the Western Front, we lost nearly 46,000 dead, 5 times as many men we lost on the Western Front compared to Gallipoli. So Gallipoli deserves its place as that first iconic battle, but the reality of the real fighting, the real dying, the horrors of the First World War was really unveiled on the Western Front. So that's the story. When you go over there today, there's, as I said, we lost more than 45,000, nearly 46,000 Australians on the Western Front, and none of them were sent home. The only Australian soldiers that were sent home during the entire First World War was General Bridges, who was killed at Gallipoli, and he was returned to Duntroon, where he'd been the commander of Duntroon. And then also in 1993, Australia's unknown soldier, who was returned from Villiers. These are the only 2 Australians who were returned from the fighting of the First World War. So those 46,000 men are all still over there in France and Belgium. And so there are a lot of Australian graves. There's a lot of wonderful Australian battle sites to see. You could take months and months of walking that ground to see all those sites. So it's certainly not possible to visit them all in one trip unless you are particularly hardy. But you can visit the main sites, the most important sites, and get a very good understanding for what the Australians went through. Visit the key memorials where Australians are commemorated, and of course see literally thousands of Australian graves in this area. Now, I keep saying the word Australian, and again, I apologise to our international guests that I'm not trying to overlook the contributions of other people. And when you are over there, I strongly suggest you also follow the French actions, the British, the Americans, if you're in that section as well, and of course the Germans. Learn the whole story. Go to the Canadian memorials, which are very impressive. But time is limited for most people. I'm an Australian historian. I have an Australian audience, so I'm going to focus on the Australians. So this is not to exclude the other nations, and there are many wonderful historians who tell their stories very well, and many great books you can follow if you're interested in the British actions, the Canadian actions, etc., etc. But we're Australians. We're going to focus mostly on the Australian operations. So that's the Western Front. So let's talk about where this area is. I'm going to upload a map to the Facebook page so that you can go and see this if you're either listening on the podcast or watching on the Facebook Live. But it's from my book, Walking with the Anzacs, which is my guide to the battlefields of the Western Front. And the map that we're referring to here, I will show you, is the map on page 2, which really shows the battlefields of the Western Front. You can see that there. So we're talking the area north of Paris. That's Paris right at the bottom. we're talking the area north of Paris, stretching right up just across the Belgian border. So if you're playing along at home, feel free to open up Google Maps or grab an atlas so that you can see exactly the areas I'm talking about. But you don't need a map to follow what I'm saying. Just bear in mind that basically we're talking that area about an hour north of Paris. That's the region where we're discussing. So the very top corner of France, right next to the English Channel. And so, firstly, how do you visit this area? Obviously, you have to fly internationally. It's a long way away from Australia, but it's a lovely part of the world to visit. That's an obvious thing to say. To go into Paris, we're fortunate through this quirk of history that this took place in such a wonderful part of the world, because Paris is one of the world's most wonderful cities. Brussels itself is very interesting in Belgium. There's lots of interesting sites in this area, so I'd encourage you to go over and see them just for the sake of the cultural experience of visiting France and Belgium. In terms of visiting these areas, you're going to need a little bit of help to do it. The number one thing I'd say, I don't say this for any reason except I want to do what I can to show you around. I'd love you to join one of our tours. The tours have been designed by me to take people around with the best historians so that they don't miss out on anything. And I'm not doing this as a sales pitch. I'm doing this because I genuinely believe the best way to visit the battlefields is with one of our historians on one of our tours. So I'd love, of course, you all to join us on a tour to the Western Front, and it's a really wonderful experience. But you don't have to. There's many other ways to do that. So this is not this presentation is not a plug for our tour company. This is a presentation about why you should visit the battlefields, and I believe everyone should if you're interested in Australian history at all. And this shows you every way that you can do it. So the number one way I'd like to suggest is to join us on one of our tours. But if you don't want to do that, there's certainly many other ways to do it. You can very easily visit the battlefields yourself and get around. What you miss out on with that experience is you don't travel with a historian who will bring it to life. But there's still many good resources you can find on the web. There's many good books you can read. My book, as I said, Walking with the Anzacs, is my book that I wrote to guide people around the battlefields. So grab a copy of that book as well. And there's lots of other good guidebooks out there. There's lots of good books you can read to give you an idea. If you're going to travel on your own to the battlefields, you will definitely need to hire a car. There is no question about that. There's no public transport to speak of in the area. You will need to hire a car, and that involves driving on the right-hand side of the road. Not that big a deal these days. But you will definitely need to drive yourself, because there are some fairly obscure sites that you'll definitely want to go to that even the French are quite surprised that we often turn up at these sites. So they're not well signposted. It's hard to find these places. You'll want to drive yourself. You'll definitely want a GPS or Google Maps on your phone, some sort of electronic device to help you get around. When I started visiting the battlefields 20 years ago, all we had was paper maps, and so many arguments with my travelling companions, as I'm sure you can all relate to. We all remember those days of travelling around with the passenger trying to navigate and the driver trying to do his or her best. It wasn't fun. It wasn't fun at all. I really appreciate the days of GPS when you can just jump in the car and now be directed to where you're going. So hire a car. If you can, hire a 4-wheel drive, because it's good to also get off the beaten track a little bit. And definitely get a GPS as well when you do that. So that's the first thing to say. Where are you heading? What region are you heading for? I'll delve a little bit deeper into the regions where the Australians fought, but the main town you're going to want to aim for, there's really two main towns you're going to want to aim for. The town of Amiens in France, that's Amiens, Amiens as we would say in Australia, but in French, Amiens. So the town of Amiens is in the heart of the Somme region. So that's a fairly central point with lots of accommodation and good access to the battlefields. The other main town you want to head for is the town of Ypres. Now, this is the town, the name is a little bit confusing. It was called Ypres during the war, Y-P-R-E-S. The soldiers themselves called it Wipers because of that spelling. The British adopted the uniform French spelling of all the places on the Western Front, including the ones in Belgium. But as a matter of fact, the people in Belgium actually speak Flemish or Dutch in this part of the world. So the town of Ypres is how it's always been called by the local people, and they spell it I-E-P-E-R. So we historians today, people in general, when they refer to it, talk about Ypres is the town, Y-E-P-E-R. Some people, when they see that written capital I-E-P-E-R, think that it says leper when they see it on a sign. It's not leper, it's Ypres. Bear that in mind. So the town that was known as Ypres during the war is now known as Ypres. So that's the other town, which is the main place people will want to stay. There's also the very big French city of Lille, which is about 45 minutes from Ypres, where lots of people choose to stay. But you can stay in Ypres itself, and that's a much better option, and we'll get into why that is in a minute. So those are the main sort of destinations you'll be heading for. Amiens is about an hour and a half's drive north of Paris. Ypres is probably 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours north of Paris. You can catch trains to these places. Ypres is a bit harder to get to, but you can definitely catch a train to Amiens. But once you get to Amiens, you'll then be stuck in the town unless you hire a car. So it's probably better to pick up a car and drive up there. What I usually do is fly into Charles de Gaulle Airport, which is north of Paris. So coincidentally, it's in the right direction for heading up to the battlefields, and I hire a car there, and then you don't have to drive in Paris at all. You can head straight onto the motorway and straight up to Amiens, and you'll be there in probably an hour. So that's a good tip. The other good thing to do is to catch the Eurostar from London and get off in Lille, that big city that I mentioned before, and then hire a car at the Eurostar station, and then you'll be in Ypres in 45 minutes. So these are all good little tips for how to get around. There's lots of accommodation in both those places. In my book, Walking with the Anzacs, I list all that accommodation, but you'll be able to find some great hotels in both those places. I recommend the Albion in Ypres is a wonderful family-owned property that we use a lot. People who've been on our tours would remember the Albion, no doubt. In Amiens, the Mercure is a good hotel right in the heart of town. It's it's a little bit soulless. It's an international chain. It's well located, though. The other good place to stay, actually, while I mention it, in the Somme region, not too far from Amiens, in the heart of the battlefields, is the town of Albert. And there's a little hotel which is called the Royal Picardy in Albert, which I would recommend as well. That's Albert, Albert, Albert. The Australians used to call it Bert, that town. So Albert, as the French say, is right in the heart of the battlefields. It's got less facilities than Amiens, but it's very, very conveniently located for the battlefields, particularly Posi, the main Australian battlefield. So I hope that gives you a little bit of structure about where we're going. We're north of Paris. These are the main towns we're visiting. Hire a car to get around. Catch the train up there if you want to, but then hire a car when you get there, or just drive from Paris. So that's the structure. So jump on a map and have a look to make that a little bit clearer. But let's talk now about what you're going to want to visit when you're up there. I mean, the question is, how long should you spend up there when you do a tour? You can't really do a day tour and take in all the key sites. You could do a day tour that took in one of the key sites. So if you're in Paris, you could potentially jump in a car and go up to Amiens and see the Somme battlefield sites for one day. Or if you're in Brussels, for example, you could jump in a car and go west to Ypres and do a day tour in Ypres. That's good if that's all you've got time for. And seriously, if that's all you've got time for, visiting the battlefields is better than not visiting them at all. So definitely do that if you can only afford one day. But what I would strongly recommend is find the time in your itinerary to visit them all. We're not talking a lot of time. In 3 days, you can visit all the key sites. So over a weekend, you can see all the key Australian sites. And trust me, you'll be absolutely thrilled that you did. Because if you just do one day, you're going to miss out on some very important sites. And you won't have the full story of the Australian involvement. And in 3 days, you're not going to get overwhelmed, but you'll be able to see those key Australian sites and learn the whole history of Australia's involvement. And I've got to be honest, if we're going to go to this trouble of going and visiting them to remember these blokes, I think the least we can do is find the time to hear their whole story rather than just isolated little pieces of it. So what are the areas you're going to want to visit? So let's assume you've got a few days at least. Our longer tours tend to be about 10 days, in which case you can get a lot more involved. We do a lot more than just battlefields in a 10-day tour. 3 days is a minimum. 3 or 4 days is probably what you want as a minimum, maybe up to 5 days if you're really interested in seeing a lot of these sites. There's an awful lot of cemeteries. There's about 2,000 cemeteries, and about 750 of those have Australians in them. So you could spend many years just visiting the cemeteries. So if you add an extra couple of days, it'll give you more time to explore the history in a bit more detail. So I'm going to break this down. This is actually almost a little bit different to even what I do in the book, in Walking with the Anzacs, when I break down the main battlefield areas. And the reason for that is that the book goes into a lot of detail. So if you're following a relative or there's a specific action you want to follow, that's what the book enables you to do. If you're just talking about visiting the battlefields in general, you don't need quite that level of detail. So I'm going to give you 4 broad areas where the Australians fought during the First World War. So forgive me looking away. I'm actually looking at the map in my book to reference this. There's really 4 key areas you'll want to go to visit the battlefields where the Australians fought in the Western Front. And let's start right up the top. That's the area known as the Ypres Salient. Now, the word salient means a bulge in the front line. And if you look at a map that shows the trench lines where the Allies fought during the First World War, you'll see that the front line throughout the entire war bulges around the town of Ypres. And that's called a salient. What happens with a salient is the enemy attacks and they manage to push you back on the flanks, but they don't succeed in the middle. And that's exactly what happened when the Germans attacked Ypres in 1914. They managed to get very, very close to the town. They pushed the Allies back on both sides of the town, but couldn't actually remove them from the town. So it meant that the Allied front line bulged out into German territory. Salients are a terrible thing to defend, and military strategists always talk about straightening out salients. You don't want to be caught in a salient. And the reason is, if you imagine that the front line bulges, the enemy is surrounding you on three sides. So just imagine the volume of fire the enemy can pour into that space. And that's exactly what the Germans did in Ypres. That's why in this tiny little area known as the Ypres salient, more than 1 million men were killed or wounded during the course of the war. And it is a tiny area. The question is that everyone always asks, well, why didn't the British just abandon Ypres? Why did they maintain this salient in their line? Why did they not just give Ypres up and straighten the line out, and the fighting would have been much easier? And that's true, it would have been much easier. The reason they didn't is more political and more ideological than to do with military strategy. And the reason was that Britain joined the First World War to defend Belgium. When the Germans invaded neutral Belgium, that was the thing that prompted the British to join the war. And so Belgium was their reason for fighting. And the Germans captured all of Belgium effectively except for Ypres, this tiny little corner. Ypres was the only major town that the Germans had not captured during the war. So it was very symbolic for the British that they still held this town, and they were determined that they were going to hang on to it. So the British were in Ypres. They were not going to let the Germans force them out, which means that the Ypres salient was maintained for the entire course of the First World War. It got bigger and smaller at various times. The Allies took back a lot of ground in 1917. In 1918, the Germans pushed in again and nearly captured the town. But the Ypres salient remained throughout the war. And because of the nature of that fighting, because you had this little bulge in the line that both sides were so desperate to occupy, the casualties were huge in a very small area. What that means to us today is in a very small area, there's a lot to visit. So it's a really wonderful part of the battlefields to go and see. I should also mention from a history perspective that Ypres was considered the key to the Channel ports. It's not very far at all from the English Channel. And so whichever side occupied it really had control of that section of the English Channel. That's why it was so important. It was also surrounded by a series of ridges, which are relatively low in the grand scheme of things, but pretty important in the flat Flanders countryside. So that's Ypres, the town of Ypres, a wonderful place to visit. Definitely it should be on your list as a place you want to go to in the battlefields. The Belgians are really wonderful people. Ypres is a really wonderful town. I say in the book that it's a bit like visiting an old friend every time you go to Ypres. It's just a really lovely town. It was completely destroyed during the war. Virtually there wasn't a building left standing, and they've rebuilt it. It took until 1962 to finish rebuilding the town, but it's now a faithful reproduction of how it was before the war. It's just a really lovely town. The people are wonderful. They all speak English. Fantastic food. If you're a beer drinker, there's about 300 beers they serve in the pubs in all the towns. Lovely Belgian beer, which is one of my highlights whenever I go over there. Great food, great people. The important thing about Ypres is the history is concentrated in that town. Anyone who has been to Ypres will know that it's within the town and the fields around it. There's a huge amount of history to go and see in a very small area. So it's really a wonderful. You get a wonderful impression of what it was like during the First World War when you visit Ypres. There's great restaurants, great hotels to stay in, great museums. There's several good museums in Ypres that you should check out and in the surrounding areas. But also probably the most important thing to see in Ypres and the highlight for most people when they go to the Western Front is the Menin Gate. And the Menin Gate is that huge memorial archway that records the names of 54,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers missing from the fighting in the Ypres salient. Not only is it an impressive memorial, but they do the most wonderful thing there every night. They began this in 1928, a year after the memorial opened. The local fire brigade came out and would play the last post under the Menin Gate. Now, the Menin Gate is over a main road and traffic goes through there. So what they would do is stop the traffic, and for 20 minutes or half an hour, they'd play the last post and have a small service. This went on, rain, hail or shine. Even when there were no visitors who bothered to turn up and hear it, the fire brigade would come out and play the last post. And this went on. The only time this has stopped, the only nights this has not occurred since it began in 1928, a year after the memorial opened, was during the 4 years of German occupation in the Second World War. And the wonderful thing about that is that in 1944, when the town was liberated, the first day the town was liberated, the buglers came back to recommence the last post service at the Menin Gate. Absolutely incredible. And according to the legend, there was still fighting going on in the outskirts of the town when they began the last post service again. Really wonderful stuff from the Belgians. It just shows their commitment to not letting this history fade away. And the thing that always strikes me about the last post that I think is so remarkable is that would be remarkable if these were Belgian victims of the war they were remembering, but it's not. These are British. These are people from overseas that came along. So just a really wonderful thing. So the last post service still goes on every night at 8 p.m. They stop the traffic like they've always done. The buglers come out and they play the last post. I said before that they even used to do it when no one turned up. That is not the case anymore. Thousands of people, literally 1,000, sometimes 2,000 people will turn up to see this. There is just hundreds and hundreds of people, often thousands of people come to see it. If you are in Ypres and you want to go to the last post, get there by 7 p.m. to get a good spot so you can see what's going on, because otherwise you won't see what's happening there. So the last post service at the Menin Gate is absolutely wonderful and a highlight of anyone's visit to the Western Front. We incorporate that into every tour that we do to the Western Front because it's just so special. And it will be a highlight for you as well, I guarantee it. So that's something not to miss. That in itself is reason enough to go to Ypres. But there's also so many wonderful things to see within the town itself and the fields just around it. So battlefields around Ypres that you may have heard of. The famous ones are Passchendaele is probably the most famous one, the Battle of Passchendaele. The big battle we remember is the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. Passchendaele, Hill 60, you'll remember the movie from several years ago, Beneath Hill 60. Polygon Wood was a very big Australian battle in the area. Messines Ridge, another great Australian operation at the time in June 1917, was considered the most successful attack of the war. Just lots of great sites in that area. A very wonderful, big German cemetery as well, a place called Langham, which you should also see to try and get a perspective on the German side of things. There's a lot to see in the Salient, but because it's so compact, you can do it in a day, which is very handy. The main sites you can take in a day. Spend an extra day there if you want to go and explore further afield, because there is a lot to see, a lot of great small cemeteries in there, just really fascinating history. So that's the area of Ypres, which is the first place we're going to talk about. The next area to discuss, we're going to head right south now to the area of the Somme, is the other famous battlefield. This is an area about an hour and a half north of Paris. And the Somme region. The Somme is interesting from a history perspective because it was crucial to the fighting. It's named, the region is named after the river, the Somme River that runs through there. It was crucial to the fighting throughout the war, but the two big battles we remember in the Somme was in 1916, the big British and French combined operation to attack the Germans, one of the biggest operations of the war, the famous Battle of the Somme, and then also 1918, which I'll get to in a minute. So the 1916 fighting in the Somme is mostly remembered, probably misremembered, I'd say, by what occurred on the first day. And on the first day, Kitchener's new army from Britain, men who'd volunteered mostly from the working class areas of the north. That was a lot of the men who joined Kitchener's new army, and they joined in 1915 and early 1916. And you remember the famous poster of Lord Kitchener pointing and saying, "I want you for the army." So the Kitchener's new army were all these new recruits that joined in 1915 and 1916, and their first big test was on the Somme on the 1st of July 1916, and they were poorly trained. They had not been fully trained. There was a shortage of officers. There was a feeling that these young recruits would not be able to do well they'd get confused if they charged across no man's land. So the idea for this attack was there was going to be a 1-week artillery barrage. They fired more than 1 million shells during this week on the German lines. The theory was the German lines would be so pulverised there'd be no Germans left to fight, and the British would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the trenches. They said to the new recruits in Kitchener's new army, do walk across the battlefields. Don't even have bullets loaded into your rifles, because they were concerned, not without reason, they were concerned that these new recruits would get confused, that they'd get mixed up if they ran, and they'd waste valuable time trying to get their units sorted out and be vulnerable to German counterattacks. It wasn't unreasonable. The Australians used to do the same thing as well. It wasn't just a British thing. The Australians would do the same thing. But it went terribly, terribly wrong, and I think we all know the story of the Battle of the Somme, that the Germans had deep dugouts that hadn't really been accounted for. The artillery didn't do as good a job as they wanted for breaking up the wire. The British got out of their trenches. They attacked at 7:30 in the morning in broad daylight. They walked across no man's land. The Germans were ready and waiting for them and absolutely mowed them down. It was a huge slaughter in most parts of the line, not universally. In some parts of the line, they did quite well on the first day. But across the board in most places, it was an absolute slaughter. And by the end of that first day, the British had lost 60,000 men killed or wounded. So that's 40,000 wounded and 20,000 killed in that one day alone. So the British lost as many men on the first day as we lost killed in the entire war. So it was quite a disaster, still considered the worst day in the history of the British Army. So the 1st of July 1916 still scars the battlefields of the Somme. Lots of the cemeteries you go to have graves from the 1st of July. A lot of the memorials pay tribute to British soldiers who were killed on the 1st of July 1916. So some of the key places to go to there really do tell that story of the 1st of July very, very well. The Australians weren't involved in that fighting in the 1st of July. They weren't involved until the 23rd of July when they were brought in as the battle was raging. They were brought in at a town called Posi. And Australia fought at Posi for 6 weeks. Posi, and next to it is a place called Mouquet Farm, known as Moucow Farm or Mucky Farm to the soldiers. They fought there for 6 weeks from the 23rd of July until early September. They were successful. They captured the village of Posi. They pushed the line forward. They nearly captured Mouquet Farm. They couldn't quite get to the farmhouse, but they got close. During that time, Australia lost 23,000 men killed or wounded around Posi and Mouquet Farm, and it remains the most costly battlefield in Australian history. So that's one of the key sites from 1916 in that area. You'd also want to see the British sites if you're in the area, such as the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing, which has got about 72,000 names of missing soldiers on it. And quite important to see is the Newfoundland Memorial Park at Beaumont-Hamel. Now, that sounds a little bit obscure. It remembers the men from the Newfoundland Regiment that attacked there on the 1st of July 1916. But I've got to say the reason it's so wonderful is after the war, the Newfoundland government acquired that entire section of front line, including the trenches, and they've maintained the trenches. So it's the only place you can see a full trench system, one of the few places you can see a full trench system. You've got the British trench where the Newfoundlanders and British soldiers attacked from. You've got no man's land, and then you've got the German lines. So it's a really wonderful place to go, and you can walk in some of the trenches, and it just gives you a fantastic impression of what the battlefields were like. So that's another highlight of the battlefields. There's a lot of other sites to see in the 1916 area. Check out my documentary that's on YouTube and Facebook now called The Battle of the Somme, Walking the Battlefields of the Somme. We visit several of these key places from that 1916 fighting. So the Somme is an area you'll definitely want to visit to learn the story of that fighting in 1916. But also in 1918, the fighting returned to the Somme area because the Germans launched a very major attack at the start of 1918 called the German Spring Offensive, which came right through the Somme area and pushed the British right back. And then the British counterattacked, which led to the big advance that ended the war in 1918. So there's a lot of very heavy fighting in the Somme in 1918 as well. And for Australians, we remember a lot of key battles in that time, the most famous of which was the Battle of Villiers in April 1918. And that's also in the heart of the Somme area and can be easily visited from Amiens and from Albert. Amiens was actually the objective the Germans were trying to capture during their big push forward that led to the Battle of Villiers-Bretonneux. So Villiers-Bretonneux is one of the major sites. Mont-Saint-Quentin is another very important site. The city of Amiens itself, even though there's not much to see from the war, is important. So, and of course, the scenes of the Great Australian Advances after Villiers-Bretonneux. The Battle of Hamel is another important one, July the 4th, 1918, and the battles that occurred after there. August the 8th, General Monash that's really his masterpiece. Hamel, in my opinion, is not General Monash's masterpiece. His masterpiece was August the 8th, 1918. It's known as the Battle of Amiens, but it actually took place east of Hamel. And that was this great advance where the British advanced, led by the Australians and the Canadians, advanced about 12 kilometres on the first day. So I'm giving you a whole mess of place names and history here, but jump on the web or grab a copy of Walking with the Anzacs and it'll all make sense. But the Somme is definitely a region you want to visit. So that's the first two regions, Ypres, the Ypres Salient, and the Somme are the two important regions you want to visit. The other one that is essential to visit is the area in between Ypres and the Somme. So Ypres is up in the north, the Somme is down in the south, and there's an area in between. A name for this, sometimes I refer to it as French Flanders. Technically, the regions are called the Pas de Calais, is the French name for it, or the Nord region, Nord, which means north. It doesn't matter what you call it. This area between Ypres and the Somme, the key sites you're going to want to see there, there's really two main sites you're going to want to see. The first one is right up on the border near Belgium, is the battlefield of Fromelles. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the battlefield of Fromelles. This was Australia's first operation on the Western Front, July 19 and 20, 1916. and the Australians attacked, and it was a disaster. 5,533 Australians killed or wounded in 20 hours of fighting, an absolute disaster. The attack never should have happened. It was all a bit of a debacle. We'll go into that in another podcast, or look at Roger Lee's podcast from last year. You'll hear all about his views on the Battle of Fromelles. A great podcast and a wonderful account of that action. So Fromelles was a huge disaster, and again, the most costly 24 hours in Australian military history was the Battle of Fromelles. It's mostly remembered today, though, because about 10 years ago, a rather eccentric Melbourne school teacher by the name of Lambus and Glazos. I know Lambus well, and if you're watching, Lambus, hello. Lambus did a wonderful thing. He discovered through records and through photographs that he felt that the numbers of the missing at Fromelles were wrong, that something was amiss there. The graves didn't match the numbers of missing. And he determined through his research that there was a grave. There was a mass grave that contained Australians who'd been killed during the Battle of Fromelles. And over many years of painstaking work, he was proven correct. He was vindicated when they discovered there was a mass grave there that had been overlooked by graves authorities, and there were about 250 bodies in it, most of whom are Australians. And so these were uncovered and excavated, and they took DNA samples. And in 2010, they opened the first cemetery. The Commonwealth War Graves opened its first cemetery since the Korean War in Fromelles to rebury these men. And I'm not sure what the latest count is, but it's more than 150, I think, of these men have now been identified thanks to DNA, which is really wonderful. So Fromelles is definitely a place you want to go and visit. There's a wonderful Australian museum there. There's the cemetery with the graves in it. There's lots of other cemeteries with Australians buried there. The site of the mass grave, and of course the battlefield itself, which has the wonderful Cobbers statue, and one of my favourite cemeteries on the Western Front, VC Corner Cemetery, where lots of Australians are buried, and there's no headstones in that cemetery at all because all of the graves are unknown. So lots of wonderful sites to see in Fromelles. Other sites you want to see in that Pas-de-Calais region are definitely Bullecourt, the town of Bullecourt, the village of Bullecourt. This was attacked by the Australians twice in 1917, in April and then again in May, and we lost 10,000 men killed or wounded in the taking of Bullecourt. The first attack in April was a disaster. The second attack was quite successful, although quite a battle of attrition. So that was breaking into the German Hindenburg Line, which you may have heard of in your history books as well. So that took place at Bullecourt. And so again, that's a really wonderful battlefield to visit. I like Bullecourt as a battlefield because it hasn't changed very much since the war. The trenches are gone, but there's a lot of landmarks that are still there from the fighting. A railway embankment, which was a crucial part of the battlefield where the Australians attacked from, is still there. Crossroads, where the Australians fought, are still there. And of course, the Australian Memorial Park. So Bullecourt is definitely a place you want to go to. A great destination for Australian visitors. And also, if you're in that region, call in near the town of Arras, which is a famous town where a lot of the fighting occurred. Call in and visit Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge is a Canadian memorial and battlefield, which is really quite spectacular. I don't know what it is about the Canadians, but they just did a brilliant job after the war of building wonderful memorials. And Vimy Ridge is the best of the lot. It's a magnificent memorial looking out over the countryside. There's a whole network of preserved trenches on the side. It's just a really great place to visit. So spare a thought for the Canadians who fought alongside the Australians on many, many occasions, particularly in 1918. We suffered about the same number of casualties. We had about a population about the same size. So Australia and Canada were really brothers in arms, along with the Kiwis as well, of course. But the Canadian Memorial is really something special to see at Vimy Ridge. So count that in as well. So effectively, that's our 3 days. We do 1 day in the Ypres Salient, we do 1 day in the Somme, and we do another day travelling in between Ypres and the Somme. So whether you're heading north to south or south to north, the middle day would be visiting Pas-de-Calais, those regions, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and the sites in between. Now, there's a fourth area that I'm going to talk about here, which is the area east of the Somme, which is called the Aine, A-I-S-N-E. Now, the Aine was very, very important in Australian military history in the latter part of 1918. So if you imagine that in the start of 1918, the Germans attacked through the Somme region once again. They were stopped from capturing Amiens, most famously by the Australians at Villers-Bretonneux. Then in August 1918, we began pushing the Germans back. And this is what we call the 100 Days, the advance to victory, the big attack that led to the end of the war. So between the start of August and the start of October 1918, the Australians were fighting just about every day to push back the Germans in this sector, and they pushed them well out of the Somme area, well into the next department to the east, which is called the Aine. So the Aine was the scene of fighting that was quite different from what had gone on for the rest of the war. This was the Australians advancing against the Germans, hurried fighting retreat, setting up in a village, fortifying that village, the Australians attacking, clearing the village, and then usually leaving their dead buried in the local cemetery and moving on to the next one. So the Australians were attacking once or twice or sometimes 3 times in a day and pushing through this area very, very quickly. So some of our greatest achievements of the First World War took place in the department of the Aine. The history is really important, and if you have the time, I absolutely recommend that you go there and see these sites. But what I will say about it is because the fighting was so swift, because they would just pass through towns very, very quickly and move on to the next one, there's not a lot to see anymore that remains from that fighting. These villages were not destroyed like Posi or like Villiers, Bret. No, they were not. They were slightly damaged, but they weren't destroyed in any way. And except for cemeteries where these men now lie, there's not really much to see there from the war. So there were no trenches really to speak of in this form of fighting. It was very open fighting, so there's not even trenches that remain. So really the only thing to see in these towns are the cemeteries. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting you shouldn't go and visit these sites. But if you're short on time, if you want to connect with the history in a tangible way by walking in trenches or finding German machine gun bunkers or these sorts of things, you're not going to find it in the Aine region. But still, you should absolutely go there. On most of our tours, we don't, in general, go to the Aine, simply for that reason, that it's difficult to tell the history, and really all you can do is drive through these villages and look at the cemeteries, and after a while people suffer a little bit from cemetery fatigue where all the cemeteries start to blend into one. So it's well worth going to. I love the Aine. I think it's a fantastic region, some wonderful memorials, some wonderful Australian history there, but it's a little bit different from the rest of the place. So if you're short on time, I'd focus on the Somme and the Ypres Salient and those other battlefields, and make the Aine a stop if you have the time. So that's in the area sort of east of the town of Peronne and heading well east. It's also a long way away from the main centre. Not a long way away, but it's a couple of hours probably from Amiens to get out there. But well worth doing if you have the time. It's really a wonderful part of the history. So that's the 4 regions I'd recommend that you go to. The Ypres Salient, the Somme, Pas-de-Calais region in between Ypres and the Somme, and then if you have time, the Aine region. Add an extra day on to go out to the Aine. It's a really wonderful story. If you do make it out to the Aine, go to Montbrehon, which was the last Australian battle of the war, and check out my podcast from last year on the anniversary of the Battle of Montbrehon. Really wonderful battle. Not a wonderful battle, a wonderful story of a terrible battle. But Montbrehon has a really lovely cemetery, which is called High Tree Cemetery, and it's way to the east of Montbrehon. It's quite isolated, it's just out on its own. It doesn't have many graves. But I like that cemetery symbolically, and I said this in Walking with the Anzacs, and I say it when I take people there, that that's the easternmost cemetery on Australia's last battlefield of the war. There are other cemeteries further east where Australians are buried, mostly Australians who died as prisoners of war. But in terms of the battlefields themselves, High Tree Cemetery at Montbrehon is the most easterly Australian, or the most easterly cemetery on Australia's most easterly battlefield of the war. And there's a couple of graves there. I think it's Private Taylor, from memory, has the grave that is then the easternmost Australian grave in the cemetery. So I like to always stand in front of Private Taylor's grave and think about the journey of the Anzacs that began on the beaches of Anzac Cove. And if you've done Gallipoli and then you do the Western Front, it's a wonderful, incredible, strange feeling to stand there at that grave, that individual grave, and to think about the journey that you've been on from Anzac Cove and that the Anzacs were on. You followed in the footsteps of the Anzacs all the way from Anzac Cove to that grave in Montbrehon. And sadly, several of the people that were killed, maybe 20 or 30 of the men that were killed in the Battle of Montbrehon, were Gallipoli veterans. They had served at Gallipoli all the way through the war and then were killed on the last day of Australia fighting in the war. So if you make it to the Aine, definitely go to Montbrehon and definitely visit that cemetery. The final little part of the history is that people ask what were the Australians doing on November 11 when the war ended. The Australians were not in the line. They were so exhausted by their fighting between August and October that by order of the Prime Minister, they were pulled out of the line. So the Australians were in the rear area when the armistice was declared. So October 5, the Battle of Montbrehon is the last Australian operation of the war. And also go and visit the graves when you're in that area of Harry Fletcher and Austin Mahoney, who were 2 mates who enlisted together as privates from Victoria. So all the Victorians watching, thumbs up for you guys. Mahoney and Fletcher joined together from Victoria as privates. Both of them served at Gallipoli, and both of them were promoted throughout the war until eventually, in 1918, they were both captains, they both won the Military Cross, and they were both leading separate platoons of the 24th Battalion at Montbrehon, the last battle of the war. And sadly, both of them were killed on the same day. Both of them were killed on the 5th of October at the Battle of Montbrehon in separate areas. So just an absolute tragedy. So visit the graves of Fletcher and Mahoney when you're there in the Aine region, and just remember their story, which symbolises those shocking casualties that took even Gallipoli veterans in those final days of the war. So that's really it. That's my summary of how to visit the Western Front. I hope that's given you some good information. As I said, refer to a map. I'll upload a map to the Facebook page so you can see exactly what I'm talking about, but those regions should be fairly clear. When you look at an itinerary on our website, if you're thinking of joining us on a tour, and please do, we'd love to have you. If you look at that itinerary, you will see those regions that I've talked about, and hopefully that will make more sense now when you read that itinerary. You can see that we visit those key sites in all of those battle areas, with the exception of the Aine. But definitely in the Somme, the Ypres Salient, and the Pas de Calais region, we visit all those key sites. So do it. Go to the battlefields of the Western Front. You will absolutely not regret it. It's such a wonderful Australian experience. You visit those cemeteries and you read inscriptions from families back in Australia who never got to visit the graves. Don't forget that. When you go and stand in front of that grave, you're completing the pilgrimage that the families never got to do. They never got to visit those graves. It was just too far in the 1920s and the 1930s to sail all the way from Australia to France to go and visit these graves. So when you are there standing in front of that grave and you read only son of Mr. and Mrs. Watson from Bundanoon, you are completing that journey that family never got to make. And that's a wonderful thing. And it will stay with you. It stays with me every day when I'm over in the battlefields. So please do it. Please visit the battlefields. Pick up a copy of my book. I saw there's a couple of questions there about where you can get the book. It's usually available in bookshops. It's still in print. It's been in print since I wrote it many years ago. Download it. It's available through all the main Amazon and iTunes and all the main e-book suppliers. You can find it in bookshops, and if they don't have it, they can certainly order it in for you. And grab a copy of that book, which will hopefully bring this a lot more to life. Please join us on a tour if you would like to. We have probably our best tour is our 4-day Explorer tour, which departs and ends in Paris and visits all the sites I've just talked about. See me over there for Anzac Day. Anzac Day is wonderful on the Western Front at Villiers Bret. So there's lots of ways to do it. Or simply, next time you're in Paris, if you're lucky enough to be going to Paris, grab a copy of my book, jump in a car, and spend a few days exploring the battlefields. You'll be absolutely thrilled that you did. Thank you very much for your time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off now for the podcasters. I'm going to say thank you very much to the podcasters, people who are listening to this, and I'm going to end the recording now for the podcasters. If you're watching on Facebook Live, stick around and we can have a question and answer session just about any queries you may have. Thank you very much. I'll see you on the Western Front. Goodbye to the podcasters and the Facebook Live watchers. I'll see you in a minute.